So welcome all for joining us. Today is our final session of the South Frederick Corridors Placemaking Charrette. Hard to believe. It's been a journey, and we're glad that y'all came back for this last session. So we do have some information we're going to provide to you to get through quickly. We'll go through some of the information that we compiled from our last session, and then we'll do a little more interactive polling and some small group discussions. And then we will discuss next steps and what you can expect moving forward for the South Frederick Corridors plan. Again, just keep yourselves on mute if you don't mind when you're not actively speaking. Feel free, as always, to share your ideas via the chat or verbally. And we've all, I think, been really great at listening to and considering the opinions of everyone else. So I think that has been a successful effort in discussions for the charrette. We are going to use some interactive polling today. This is the same interactive polling platform we used, I think, back in the first session, the kickoff. So this can be accessed by going to the pollev.com website. So that's www.pollev.com. And then there's that username that you enter, which is TrueTrain007. That's one word. We'll pull that up again later, so you have that information when we're going to start doing the polling. So let's get started. Our agenda today, we're going to do a quick summary of what we've accomplished so far throughout this effort. We're going to talk a little bit about the exercise that y'all did last Thursday, identifying those future development place types on the map of the South Frederick Corridors area. We'll talk a little bit about those and get some information via polling from you. We'll break out into some smaller groups to start talking about how we can start moving the vision into reality. And then we'll talk about what's going to come next. So just in summary, to sort of bring you back to where you started and where we are today, we had our kickoff session last Monday on April 5th. Which was really great. We heard from some inspiring and informational panelists who gave us some really great information about the dynamics of the planning area and some ideas about what could potentially happen there. And we started to think a little bit about opportunities and visions for the planning area. In our first work session last Tuesday, we started to think about potential opportunities in the South Frederick Corridors area and the timing perhaps of different types of redevelopment that might occur there, if it would occur at all. We also identified some areas that are perhaps not going to be developed. And then in our session last Thursday, we started to think more specifically about the characteristics and styles of potential development that could occur in this planning area. So whether that's your mixed use neighborhood, your town center, the high tech centers, some of those employment hubs. And we worked in those small groups to start identifying those on the maps. This was also a really great opportunity that folks took to start identifying some potential connections and green spaces in the planning area. And what we've done in the week since we last spoke is try to pull out some of the key features of those different ideas that you all had for the future place types and highlighted some similarities and differences between them. And we're going to talk more in depth about those today. And our goal is really going to be to start thinking about how we can pull the best out of each of those scenarios and form them into one sort of master development vision for the South Frederick Corridors area. So I think I just spoke a little bit about this. So we are going to go through each of the 4 different scenarios that you all put together last week. We'll show you those and highlight some of the key features and elements. We will do a little bit of discussion and polling to identify some of those key elements that we really want to hold on to move forward. And then in our small groups, we're going to start thinking more specifically about the who and the how that's needed to move this plan forward into reality. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate. She's going to walk you through these different vision scenarios and describe some of them and show some visual features. And I will be manning the presentation. So Kate, just let me know if there's anything we can focus in on or go back to, and then we'll do some polling.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Just real quick, I know we jumped into it, but just a reminder of who's here. If you guys wouldn't mind, go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat function, just your name plus who you represent, and that way everybody kind of knows who's on the call today. And as a reminder, you've got the Renaissance team, myself, Caroline, Hunter, and Amanda, and then we've also got our county staff team of John, Kimberly, and Dennis on the call today. So again, thank you all. So there was a lot of, I think, really great discussions that came out of our working sessions. And what we've attempted to do in a very short amount of time is try to synthesize that. And what we observed is that there really were kind of 4 distinct scenarios. And these are meant to be very conceptual, but I think there's some things to think about in terms of the organizational framework for each. So for group 1, what really evolved here and was probably the most prominent, and this was my group, so I know most about it, is the kind of introduction of this green network as an overarching organizing strategy. But in addition, one of the ways we started looking at each group is where were the town centers placed and where were the employment hubs located. And so in this version, I think, Caroline, do we get the bubbles? Yeah. You really ended up with kind of a centralized town center in and around the MARC station and kind of 3 distinct employment nodes just to the east. And then a lot of infill residential and some, not total consensus on this one about what happens on the south part of the study. But I think the biggest overarching thing here is, again, a single big town center with a strong green network, and then kind of these employment nodes with supporting infill residential in the other areas. If we go to the next slide, you see here that something a little bit different emerged, because in this case, we really ended up with what we call kind of a string of town centers. And if you click that on, you really saw that, up in the Grove Park area, pretty much where all of that existing kind of smaller parcel commercial is happening, just to the east of the quarry. And then obviously the town center near the MARC station. That really, those 3 things kind of aligned in these a string of town centers. And then in this case, you also saw in this group a strong emphasis on just a lot of employment on the south side. So we really saw this as the string of town centers and the south side employment nodes, if you will. Next slide. Group 3, very similar in terms of they were close to kind of what came out of the first group in terms of really focusing that town center at the MARC station and the mall, but they also saw kind of multiple nodes for employment. So this is a little more dispersed, where you've got kind of employment happening at Grove Park around the existing industrial center and kind of big box, and then points further south, and then infill of residential all around. That group also did call out the kind of green infrastructure pieces and really emphasize bike ped. And then the last scenario is very similar again to the 3 strings of town centers at the top, but then they really emphasized a pretty significant employment hub to the south. And so this is what we almost called it the industry anchor scenario, if you will. So if you think about these 4 scenarios, and I don't know, Caroline, do we have them all lined up in the next slide? I think what's interesting, and it's a little hard to see these, but you really do have, I think, some commonalities that almost everybody agreed on. I think that the town center designation in and around the MARC station and the mall is the most common, I would say, consensus point that most people have. The second thing is the need for this area to still really serve as a pretty significant employment hub for the county. But also recognizing that even though there may be some more heavily employment-oriented areas, there's still adequate room for continued infill residential. And where that happens, I'd say there was some consensus, although in the south side, I'd say that's where there's still maybe some question of how much employment, how much residential happens kind of in the south area, and then how do you maintain that kind of rural buffer edge? But let me pause for a moment and see if there's questions, or John or Kimberly or Dennis, any other kind of comments you all might want to make about these as we think about them as kind of 4 distinct ideas or scenarios.
I think you summed it up really well, Kate.
Okay. So one of the things that we'd like to just then kind of ask all of you to think about, and I know this is a very broad question, but we kind of want to get your initial reaction to, we probably all are a little bit biased to the group that we were in, but now that you kind of see them side by side, which of the 4 scenarios do you really think kind of best represents, the right vision for the area? And I promise we're not going to just go with one of these. As you can imagine, at the end of this whole process, we're going to take the best of all, but we'd like to just get a sense of everybody that's here today. Now that you kind of see them all lined up, which one really stands out to you as maybe the most directly supportive of and reinforcing of the goals of Livable Frederick? So this is a polling question, right, Caroline? So do
Yes.
we...
Yes, in the chat box, I put the link to the website, which is pollev.com. And then you can enter the username TrueTrain007, and you should be able to select one of the 4 vision plans that you prefer. And then just as you're thinking forward, the next thing we're going to ask you is to sort of provide some reason why you prefer that one over the others.
So we just click on just one of those text box to go ahead and
Yes.
support. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Please. Thank you.
You said you put the link in the chat box? I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, I'll drop it in there one more time.
Yeah, I think there were chats that came up and now further up on the screen.
Okay, here it is again.
Caroline, it's still not there.
It's not? Oh.
I see it. Caroline, it says you're in the waiting room for some reason, but you're in the meeting
Okay.
clearly.
I see.
There we go.
I see it.
If you guys are having any issues too, just feel free to send me a direct message in the chat with whatever choices, and we'll just, be sure to make
Yes.
note of it.
Yeah, if you can also enter 1, 2, 3, or 4. So 1 would be the upper left, 2 is the upper right, 3 is the lower left, and 4 is the lower right, if you'd prefer to just enter that into the chat.
So Caroline, do we get to see this one live?
Can you see
Or
the
you can-
little, can you see them dropping on there? The little points? Yeah.
Gotcha.
This one is a little different than some of the others that we've done. But it
I
was,
was wondering what those signals were. Are those?
yeah, it was the best way to get the biggest.
all good.
Yeah. And also, we did email out a document that has these on there as well, the 4 vision map. So if you want to take a closer look, you should have that resource. We'll give it a couple more minutes or a couple more seconds, maybe another 20 seconds for y'all to record or drop in the chat box which one you prefer. And then we'll.
Caroline, can we vote for 2?
I think we would prefer that you vote for 1.
Just checking.
Yeah.
I'm sure
I
we'll
don't
have
want
a
to throw the
conversation.
election.
we could do a secondary if we really wanted to. If people want to vote for their second favorite, I guess we could do, we could lock it and redo it if there's a very strong feeling that folks want to, but we can also just talk about it.
Right.
Or maybe
Yeah.
that's an easier thing to do in the chat.
Okay,
Why don't we
Um,
do that? If people have a really compelling desire to say, hey, I indicated my first choice on the map and in the poll, but I want everyone to know that this is my second choice. Go ahead and put the chat.
Well, it does look like there is a little bit of preference for the first one, which is the upper left, and then the other responses are sort of equally spread out between the other three. Okay, so do you want to go ahead and lock this one and we'll move to our next
Yeah.
activity? Okay, excellent. So the next thing, and I think maybe this will speak to some of you who are having thoughts about, multiple visions. So we would like to know, this is an open-ended question. Think about the vision that you did select and provide one or two of the most compelling reasons why you think that that's the best option. And again, if you're having trouble accessing the polling, please do feel free to drop them in the chat box. So green space. Green network. So we'll let these come in for a few minutes. Focusing residential in the north and then more of a node in the center. Well, I think the green space is pretty popular and something that we saw come across several of those different visions. So that's good to know. So transitioning from the city to business and employment. And again, we will provide all of this feedback to you in our final session summary. So I know that they're kind of scrolling down the screen, but you'll be able to have all of these to review after the session. I'll give you maybe another 20 seconds. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and lock it. If you've entered it and it hasn't come up, don't worry, it'll be recorded. And I think we'll go ahead and move to our next item. So one of the place types that we sort of saw the most variation in was the high-tech campus micro warehouse fulfillment center place type. And we wanted to just kind of go back and do a little bit of clarification to better describe this place type. So this is really a lower density, larger scale building footprint. So thinking sort of, wider, not so tall. This is a 90 to 10% jobs housing balance. So mostly jobs, maybe a little bit of housing. But really there's two sort of key types of development that you might find in this place type. So on the one hand, you sort of have this high tech office campus, secure type of location. And then the other hand, a land use type that we're seeing more of now as distribution, freight distribution and delivery services are becoming more predominant. we're seeing these sort of fulfillment centers and warehouse distribution centers. Definitely less conducive to this sort of vertical mixed use. And we saw it was literally all over the map, right? With this place type where folks were sort of thinking about where it might be best located, if it is best located at all in this planning area. So we wanted to ask a specific question after we sort of clarified what this place type is like, to think about where this might be useful and what that might look like in South Frederick corridors. So the next question that we have for you all is thinking about that high-tech place type. We want you to choose one of the following options. So A would be, I do not think that this high-tech place type is an appropriate user pattern for this part of the county at all. The second option is that I think both types of high-tech uses would be appropriate. So that would be both sort of your distribution, warehouse, and also maybe a campus-style office. And then C and D are focused on one or the other. So C is I only support the high-tech campus style office footprint. And then D would be I only support the warehouse style footprint in this area. So take a few minutes, think about what that might look like and how that might be integrated into this planning area. And we'll give you a little time to enter your responses. And it looks like we have a couple in the chat box. We'll make sure to integrate those into the final responses.
So while we're collecting this, obviously it's looking like there's a fair amount of support for both, but I would like to hear if folks are willing to share kind of the concerns that may be driving you to select kind of option A in terms of neither of the high tech uses really being appropriate in this part of the county. Does anyone want to share their thinking behind that? And if you don't want to reveal yourself, that's okay. You could maybe just type a chat or let us know after the fact, but it'd be good to kind of just understand the perspective there.
This is Faith. I'm gonna just jump in and say that I think the county should have a better sensitivity about when you're putting in warehouse space and if it's near or some degree surrounded by residential, because the truck traffic and the types of traffic that you then begin to bring into that area can be a significant impact on the residential communities around it. So I think we have to be smart about thinking about where that placement is. And so anything that would have high truck traffic should really be surrounded by more commercial rather than, significant bordering on residential.
Good points. Anyone else have thoughts on kind of the high tech dynamics?
Yeah, yes, I get that it's close to 270 and 70, but I agree with Faith on the location issues. And I really would like to see this area become more densely populated with live, work, access to the MARC train types of uses.
So let me ask another question, because I think one of the things I know that's came up in our group is that there's a lot of growing demand for these types of spaces, particularly the distribution facilities and that sort of thing. Are there other more appropriate areas in the county then? If not here, where? I'm just curious if anyone has like an initial reaction to that.
Yes, in the city of Frederick.
In the city of Frederick?
Yes, we have large parcels that are set up just for these kinds of things over on where the Ren Farm is.
Okay. Any other places in the county that folks would want to kind of say, hey, let's not put it here. It's either got to go to the city of Frederick or we'd support it someplace else in the county. East Alco, all right.
This is Don Pleasance. I think their uses are appropriate for certain areas within this part of the county as well as other locations within the county. There's a big demand for this type of product, and I think it's only going to be growing substantially here for the next few years.
You know, I can speak from my experience working in a large biotech company that has been helpful to actually have this both type of facility because it brought a lot more investment into this area in Frederick, and that if it wasn't for the warehouse spaces, we would have probably seen that business go someplace else.
Yeah, this is Carl. I know Don Pleasance is on the phone. He's been around a little bit longer than I have, but Frederick County, the 85 corridor has always been known as the employment corridor, hence the amount of activity is down there. And a couple of sessions ago, even last session, we talked about infrastructure. When you look at the infrastructure that's in place from 270 south on 85, you've got a multi-million-dollar interchange that was upgraded to accommodate this type of traffic. You've got a rail system that is accessible to a number of businesses in and along the Route 85 corridor. So I look at it a little bit differently in that you look at where the infrastructure's in place and ready to go. And so I think it makes sense for this, industrial footprint to be on the 85 South corridor because of the existing infrastructure. I also agree with Alderman Russell in that the city of Frederick is a really good choice, and I hope it happens soon.
Excellent points. Well, I think we'll have a little bit of time for additional discussion, but I'm glad we got some dialogue on this one because I feel like this was definitely a question amongst folks in the different groups. So Caroline, you want to keep us moving?
Sure. So our next question. So now we're starting to think about all of these pieces of the different visions that y'all really liked. And we would like you to please choose what you think are the top 5 elements or design themes that should be carried forward into the final South Frederick Corridors plan. And again, if you want to just drop your choices into the chat box, we can integrate those for you if you're having trouble.
Watching the water game at the fair with them. Who's winning?
Great.
You make your bets.
Yeah.
Who's gonna win?
It's sort of mesmerizing. We'll give folks a few minutes to get their choices in. I know it's hard to pick 5.
Yep. He gave us a challenge here. Okay, only 5.
Only 5.
Yes, we know they're all important to varying levels. But we do live in the world of limited resources, so prioritization is important too.
And some of these are maybe have some overlap.
Mhm.
Such as the one with the housing with walking distance, which obviously ties into pedestrian amenities as well.
Mhm. Right, I think that's a good point. Yeah, some are dependent on others for sure. If you're going to have better walkability, then you're going to want to have those improved connections and amenities for sure. Also, if you feel like something is missing from this list, please go ahead and let us know what is not being accounted for in the chat box. We definitely want to make sure that we get your feedback on that as well. So if there's something you're thinking about that you want to add, please do go ahead and add that. So we do have a couple suggestions in the chat, community space for arts, music, and cultural events, making sure those high tech and warehouse uses are integrated. We'll give it a couple, maybe another 20, 30 seconds so y'all can finish up your organizing. But it does look like things that are rising to the top are those jobs and housing, accessibility and being located close to one another. Institutional zoning, somebody mentioned in the chat. So that would be for schools, new schools in the area. Green energy and energy efficiency and electric vehicle infrastructure. Churches and religious uses, farmers market hub. Another comment about new schools and adding capacity in the schools. If you have a 6th choice, you can also drop that in the chat. You know, it's hard to pick. Okay, are we ready to move on to the next slide? All right, we're gonna go ahead and lock this one and move on. Okay, so our next question that we have for you all, now that we've talked about all of the amazing things that we want to make sure in the plan, thinking about moving that plan forwards to action, the next question we have for you is, what do you think are going to be the most challenging factors to redevelopment and infill within the South Frederick Corridors area? And you can choose 3 of these. Again, please feel free to add anything that's not here in the chat. Or if you have to have more than 3, you can let us know what your 4th and 5th choices are. So this was, you know, we heard a lot of these issues come up during the small group conversations that we had last week. And, you know, thinking about what's in the area now and what you're able to do now, given existing regulations and policies.
So I'm seeing the suggestion from Noel that the adequate public facilities ordinance is definitely an issue. And I wonder if you could expand on that, because we've listed transportation or other infrastructure constraints, but specifically, what is it about the APFO that's the biggest impediment for this area in particular?
If you're gonna cite all of these town centers and mixed use and residential, there's gonna be problems with the school APFO passing it.
So it's the
School.
school issue? Okay. So this is a pretty telling story, because what this suggests is that the market is there. At least from the perspective from you all on the phone or on our call or our group here, is that this isn't a market problem. This is very much a kind of government regulation and community support and adequate infrastructure.
There's another
And then
comment.
obviously the fragmented property ownership. I mean, I think we've talked about that, you know, the best way for redevelopment to happen and kind of have that catalytic impact is the larger parcels. The good news is, even though there's a lot of smaller parcels kind of in the northwest quadrant, if you will, or northeast quadrant, if you will, there are several kind of larger property ownership parcels that could really be those catalyst sites. So that's a pretty powerful dynamic for the support of the vision, if you will.
Also, if you've selected other policies and regulations, feel free to let us know what those are in the chat. If it's something that wasn't explicitly listed up here. I do see something about parking and stormwater management regulations potentially being a challenge for higher density transit oriented types of development.
Can you tell me,
So-
someone tell me what does SWM stand for, regulations?
Stormwater management.
Thank you.
Mhm. And there's a question about the limited mark service and the influence of TOD. I think we might have somebody on from the state, but I will say this, you know, TOD, it's a bit of chicken and the egg, which is that, you know, the more people you actually can locate near that transit station, eventually you start to build additional demand. And therefore that could help to make the case for additional transit service. So it is something to, you know, you can't always sync those up. You know, do you put all the people there first and then bring the transit, or do you put the transit there and hope people come? And it's always this balancing act. But the notion is that if you locate a lot more people and jobs within that station area, again, it could warrant an increase in transit service over time. The other thing you get out of TOD too is the walkability, a lot less just car dependency, simply because you're locating both jobs and employment in these nodal patterns. So there's a lot of benefit to that as well. But yeah, Jamie, I'm not sure if you're on today, but if you've got comments on that specifically from a mark perspective. I don't know if Jamie joined us today.
Yeah, Jamie's on. I'm not sure if she's
Okay.
talking or if she's in the background. If you're talking, you're muted right now.
Just to make the point that the tracks are owned by CSX, and that's the constant battle of, you know, more service.
something to think about in terms of community resistance. Like one of the things that comes up for me is in terms of infrastructure, the county is going to have to teach itself how to develop in sync with infrastructural demands. And we've never had to do that. We jumped off to a great start in development in the post-war years, but never really kept pace with the infrastructure demands, particularly schools. So the struggle in terms of developing this area going forward, at least as far as schools are concerned, may be the fact that we're not starting with a blank slate. We're starting with a deficit in this geography in terms of school capacity. And while we have system-wide capacity, we don't necessarily have that same capacity locally. So that's going to be a political battle going forward.
Are there any sites identified for future expansion for the school system? Does anyone know?
Not specific to this
Okay.
geography, but it's a few of us have started to kind of think through where that might happen. And one thing we can share with the group is that the county definitely wants to be proactive about school site acquisition and not wait for a piece of ground to fall into its hands via a development.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on. So I think we are gonna move now into doing some small group discussions. And the goal here today is thinking about all of these things that we've been discussing for the larger vision for the South Frederick Corridors planning area. We're going to get divided into our small groups again. Amanda will start that for us in just a few minutes. I think we're going to have a little bit longer than 30 minutes, which is good. So really what we're trying to get at here today is thinking about, what are sort of the immediate next steps or key challenges that are going to have to be addressed in order to move forward, and trying to start identify some of those things. And then in addition to that, who do we need to keep this moving forward, whether that's, community champions or folks who are advocating for different types of development in this area, whether that's, working with developers to make sure that, regulations or they're aware of how infill development can take place in this area, or thinking about, is it the decision makers that we need to be sort of bringing on board? So we really just want to, try and have a conversation focused on some of the actions that will need to take place in order to keep this moving forward. Kate, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that or prompt
No,
for discussion.
I would just kind of emphasize that I know that we haven't really reached consensus on the overall concept plan per se, but I think the big ideas here are significant infill and redevelopment and support for a strong, I would say, kind of mixed use component. So as you think about this question, I would keep that in the back of your mind. And if there are, as we've just been talking, certain uses or certain things that there's still disagreement about, how do we get to agreement on that? That could be something we tackle here. So just keep in mind kind of the big, broad goals that have been identified. And then let's talk about how does that come to fruition? What needs to start happening and who needs to be engaged?
Great, and I think Amanda, you can get us started. So we'll chat for, I guess we have about 45 minutes. We'll come back together and do a debrief as we've done in our past sessions, and then we'll talk about what's next. Okay. All right, I think we got everyone here. Thanks for finding your way to our small group. Maybe we'll just do a quick round of introductions so that everyone knows who is here and who we're speaking with. So just if you want to let us know your name and your organization or affiliation. And I'm Caroline Dwyer with Renaissance Planning. Kimberly, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Kimberly Golden Brand, and I'm with the Livable Frederick Planning and Design Office with John and Dennis.
And Carl?
Yeah, Carl Morris with the Matten Companies. Unfortunately, I've got to jump off in about 4 or 5 minutes. I
No
apologize.
problem. It's fine. We understand. Everybody's very busy. Shane?
Yes, I represent the Frederick Bicycle Coalition, and I'm also a local biotech scientist and bike advocate.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Joe?
Joe Adkins with the City of Frederick Planning.
Okay. And Mark?
I'm Mark Long, and I chair the Frederick County Affordable Housing Council.
Great. Elise?
Elise Cohen with Co-Enterprises.
And Kathy?
Kathy Shea, Senior Services Division. Likewise, I have a meeting at 1 o'clock too.
Sure.
Busy day.
I know. Well, we're glad you could join us. Brian?
Yeah, Brian Morris with the Matten Companies.
Great. And Audi? Is that right?
Audie, yeah.
Audie.
I'm a small business owner, but I also am in the energy efficiency sector.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks all. So I guess our mission here today is to start thinking about some of the challenges that have been raised and the opportunities that we've been discussing for the last couple of weeks, and start mapping out some of the actions or changes that maybe need to be made in order to get this plan moving from a vision into a reality based on all of the great things that we've been talking about this week. So I guess maybe I'll just start by asking kind of a broad general question, and feel free to jump in. We can have an informal conversation about what do you all think is going to be the biggest challenge in implementing a plan like this that really envisions a different development pattern for South Frederick corridors?
For me, it's APFO in schools and school testing, if we want to do multifamily. So, I mean, traffic patterns, a lot of that can be handled, water, sewer, but schools.
And I'll agree with that. That's certainly important. And it's almost essential that some place be identified for a school. I mean, as developments start to progress and develop, somewhere along the line, some land's going to have to be set aside for that, or else this doesn't work.
It's Carl Morris. I'm pretty involved in all the different developments that go on in and around Frederick County, Frederick City, and there are a number of school sites that have been identified but not acted on. And the reason they haven't been acted on is there's no money. So, it's a state-funded mandate to build a school. And there are a number of sites. So I appreciate everybody's comments about additional schools, but I think what we ought to do is we ought to look at the existing inventory of land that's out there that is slated for these schools. Not to say that the South Corridor plan shouldn't have land dedicated for that if there's a need, but I think we ought to look at what's actually in the inventory first.
Well, I'll comment a little on that. Actually, I guess it was last year, the county did identify some surplus school properties, and Jan Gardner issued an RFP, to have affordable housing developments built. And so those two school sites will have affordable housing developments built on them. And one of them wasn't too far from South Corridors, as I recall. So I'm not sure why those sites weren't being used for schools exactly. I don't know if they weren't large enough or what happened, but anyway, they won't any longer be school sites. But as this area increases in residential growth, as I envision it, there will almost have to be a school somewhere nearby, maybe not exactly in the South Corridors, but at least in somewhat close proximity.
So is anyone familiar with the APFO ordinance? What is you know, is there like regulations about how close the school has to be to where the students are? Or is it just that like the school system has to be able to absorb the new students? Does it matter where the schools are? Does anyone know?
Yeah, it's all geographic,
Mhm.
exercise that the Board of Education does to determine existing capacity and where there's a need for additional schools. So it's quite regulated with the Board of Education. So they've got a very good handle on it.
What the turnaround time, once they identify a school needs to be built, how long did it take to get into the state plan to have it built? 10 years, 7 years?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I can't speak to that. I do not know, but I know, like I said earlier, there are a number of sites that have been slated for schools that have not been acted on. Now, there may be surplus sites as was just stated, but I can't speak to that.
So school construction, sorry, just making sure I'm clear. So the construction of the schools is funded by the state? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, there is funding that comes from the state that essentially help us to build those schools. So we have a list of schools and we build them based on priority and if they're getting overcrowded and when the money comes in from the state to help build them.
I don't know the exact term, but I know there are programs where new development, those that are either buying or big developers have to pay some type of tax that goes
Developer fees.
right. So how does that get funneled to that local need with the schools?
I believe that's only in the city of Frederick, and I don't think there's an opportunity for that in the county, but I could be mistaken.
So I live in Newmarket, Lake Linganore, and I contributed to something.
Okay, well then I'm wrong.
Also building a school in the area, brand new elementary school. So
There is an impact fee that's paid for schools and libraries when you create new residential units in the county. And that money has to be used to grow capacity. So either to add on to an existing school or to build a new school. It can't be used for operations, for example.
but it exists. So
It does exist.
Could be utilized in this site.
Yeah, there's been some conversation at the council and about how this impact fee should be looking, and they've been looking at a couple of different angles, either tying it to the state cost of living type of index or other index. So there is conversation around it and recognition that how this thing is being structured is really important for future building of schools.
Yeah, the way it works is a builder goes in for a building permit and pays the building construction fee that stays locally. And then they also, depending on the level of capacity at the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school, if they're at a certain capacity, then you pay a school construction fee. But I'm not sure where that goes. Brian, do you know?
I think it goes to the same pot of money. So it's just if a school is above 100% capacity but below 120, pay the school construction fee. So, but on any residential development, there is that impact fee. You have the school and library impact fee.
You said above 100% capacity and below 120. So does that imply that above 120 you're not building?
Correct. But I'll have to bone up on it because we haven't done a residential development in a little bit. I'm not sure if that 120 got reduced to 100 or I'm not sure exactly where it's at, but.
Okay, but there is like a ceiling. Yeah, all right.
Yeah. There's an APFO regulation that if there's a CIP project to expand a school or build a new school within a 2-year window, you can keep moving. But if there's nothing within that 2-year window, you're basically dead in the tracks. You can't build.
I would say we're done talking about schools. It's if this plan does move forward and, you know, if the comp plan's open, if zoning is open, that, you know, the ORI zone, there's a lot of ORI ground around in and around this area that is kind of archaic at this point because it really lends itself towards office. It does have research and development in it, but it really just lends itself more towards office uses, which nobody's building office buildings anymore, especially for that use. So that needs something I think that needs to be revisited and looked at to have more flexible zoning to kind of keep up with the times. Because, you know, when COVID hit, you know, there's a lot of uses that were, you know, as far as like industrial uses or distribution uses, they were already on the rise, but then it exploded just because of COVID. So, you know, that may change, but you know, I think it just needs to be a little more flexible as far as the type of zoning goes.
So would that be number 2 from your perspective after APFO? That we need to go ahead and have policies in place that encourages or can put down overlays for mixed development?
Yeah, I mean, that would be maybe number 1 on my list, but.
Well, yeah, and I will say, I mean, we've had and Carl, I know you were in some of these meetings, you know, years ago when Jim Google was facilitating them. But I mean, ORI has been a problem for some time. I mean, I think there's a feeling that, you know, like it served its purpose in the 80s when people were building office parks, but it certainly doesn't serve a purpose now. So, I mean, countywide, we need to do something about ORI, but it's really coming to a head with this plan. And so, I mean, from the staff perspective, we're seeing this plan as an opportunity to figure out where we need to go with ORI. And people are now, I mean, developers are coming in and they're requesting, you know, the mixed use floating zone as a way to kind of, as a workaround, but that's a whole nother process that developers have to go through, and we don't want them to have to go through that to be able to do mixed use development.
Caroline, I apologize. I've got to run, but
I
did a
understand.
great job. Really
Thank you.
enjoyed it. It's been a lot
Good.
of fun. Yeah.
Thank you, Carl. We
Thank
appreciate
you, Carl.
it.
Yeah. See you all.
Yep.
Likewise, I've got another meeting to go to myself, but the one thing that with your questions in regards to immediate next steps and what do we need to do to move forward, gosh, I feel like Frederick County, as we saw in your querying of the group, sometimes really resistant to change. So something like this, a concept like this is going to need champions like immediately and from various sectors who can pull together to really to bring any change forward or any conversation. That's at least my 2 cents. It's a great county. I love this county, but you know, a vision such as this will need, I think, people on the front line, like right away, to champion the cause.
I'm confident that those champions will step up to the plate. We've done a lot of wonderful things in Frederick, and
Indeed we have, indeed, and plenty more to go. Plenty more to go. And this very well might be the next big one, but I look forward to it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Kathy.
So what is it you think that folks are concerned about? What is the resistance running up against?
So when I have my conversation about, you know, building out this southern area and that we want to build up and do mixed thing, the immediate knee-jerk reaction is that, well, we don't want to grow. And I said, well, Frederick County is going to grow by 100,000 people. Where do we put them? You give me them. Then once you go ahead and realize, okay, we have to find a place for people to live, businesses, then that gets them over the hump and start to think about, okay, where is the best use of resources? Where's the best place to go ahead and invest in order for this to make happen? And once you're able to get people to get beyond that, then I think they're far more open to conversation about what that should look like. One of the comments that was made in earlier, thing about, do you want a high-tech corridor warehouse or do you want this type of development, and so on. And I think for Frederick, and having been in Frederick for only like 11 years, 12 years, Frederick likes to be engaged. They like to be transparent, and they like to have a voice and a choice. And so if you present them only with one vision, they're going to react to it. If you give them 2 or 3 different visions about how one could go, then I think the Frederick County will feel more engaged in the process, and whatever bubbles up to the top, then they'll kind of say, okay, I see that 60% of the people want to go in that direction, and they'll start to kind of get behind it and support it.
I also think that if the development takes in consideration the local businesses and how can new business coming into Frederick is supporting local business either by supporting it through grants, contributing to a grant that then gets funneled to the local businesses. That is another way to put forward a solution that supports those that are already in the area and doesn't necessarily make them feel like they're being pushed out or there's more competition. I don't know if this is the right venue to talk about this, but what about thinking, for example, workforce development? The amount of workforce that will be needed to build this site over time and supporting local workforce, training and hiring local for something. I mean, this is going to be a long-term project, right?
It is.
So how can this project support those that live in the area and can get work in this area to, again, kind of support that local economy and workforce?
We don't have anybody here on the Economic Development Board, but that would be part of the role. Once they see that vision get spelled out, then they will start to kind of like, okay, how do we help this? What kind of workforce do we need, and who's the right partners to help us to develop this area? So they would need that kind of guidance, but first there has to be a vision as to what this area should look like before they can respond to it.
Yeah, and I just flag it because national companies usually come in with their own vendors, their own national contractors. There is an opportunity to see it like a national company or any company that's going to build in the space, X% have to hire local vendors and installers from local area.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a balancing act there. Given that I work for a global firm, there's a lot of supplies and reagents that not going to be accessible locally. They're going to come from China, they're going to come from India. But to your point, I think, if there was a way for us to be aware of resources in the area that could feed into our local product development and warehouses, then, I think that's a good idea. I mean, we obviously want to support local talent and local businesses.
Yeah, I think kind of all together, I mean, almost 50% of Frederick's workforce goes down the road. So the more that this area does kind of develop, I mean, because, we see a lot of companies that they love Frederick because of, there's great talent here. There's a lot of, the existing infrastructure is good. The amenities are good. So, really the talent is already here. It's just trying to attract those folks and, have employers be able to come to Frederick to support that. And I think, kind of rising tide raises all ships. So, I mean, if we can try to pull in more employers, build up this area, responsibly, I think it really would help.
And also just encouraging and establishing local relationships. So even though I'm part of a global company, I specifically target the Church of Frederick as an opportunity for us to interact with the community and to see what we as a biotech company does. And also it gives to a local Boys and Girls Club and bring them funding and stuff like that. So we do put a high prize or priority on community involvement. And so we have a very robust volunteer program in which we try to go ahead and make sure that we're spreading our wealth and our talents across the city and the county.
Well, yeah, and I think, Brian has raised an important point, and I mean, we heard a little bit of this in some of the earlier sessions, but I think some of the folks who feel like Frederick shouldn't grow, there is a feeling like you're creating jobs for people who are outside the county, or going to come. You're creating residences for people outside the county, currently outside the county, that are going to come here. And as Brian pointed out, I mean, a lot of our workforce leaves the county. And has for decades. I mean, that's not new. So, I mean, I think it's worthwhile to try and create jobs for folks that are closer to home, for their quality of life. And in terms of housing as well, I mean, I think when at the staff level, when we talk about housing in this area, and particularly having some multifamily options, having walkable mixed-use communities, I mean, we're thinking that's going to be attractive to all kinds of people who already live in Frederick County.
I am encouraged by the trend, though, of seeing more jobs staying in Frederick. 20 years ago, it would definitely imbalance. 70% would be going to DC, Baltimore, and we're seeing that shift. And like I said, you heard today, we're seeing about 50%. And I think there's enough infrastructure investment and there's enough resources here that there's no reason why we can't build on that and bring in more jobs in Frederick.
So another thing that seemed to have a lot of support across the board was enhancing connections, specifically those green connections, so trails and greenways and bike infrastructure, things like that. What is it going to take to make that happen?
That's a really good question.
Some very good planning.
Yes. Well, also significant funding. Is there a priority for this? And Joe Atkins is on here, and he's been with the Parks and Rec Department for a long time, so he's been seeing this slow development over time. And we are adding, past we are adding things. But if we feel that this is a really important part of the vision, then having increased funding, it's going to make a big difference to kind of accelerate that.
I would also add that the right incentives to developers to build those into their projects is always a smart move, because trust me, like I want my projects to look as beautiful and as green friendly as possible, but it's not always cost effective for me. So if I could have the right sort of funding situation to enhance these green areas and, do the solar panels over the parking, spaces and all that cool stuff, I totally would.
It could be a combination of incentives and also design requirements.
Sure.
So, if a particular site doesn't have accessibility, but they can help fund or support the development of a park, down the way, having those options as a developer to contribute to that plan.
Yeah. And developers and city planners are very well aware that, we are incorporating complete street policy, which brings into account the whole accessibility, bringing in the ADA requirements and all that. And it's just being done over time. So we've only really just got into that within the past 5 years. You're seeing some of it now, but at the rate we're going, it's going to take a while. But any new development that pops up definitely has to hew to these guidelines, and so we're going to see more of the development. We'll have these accessible places, but I think the idea of green spaces is a really important concept, and that's something that we would need to go ahead and highlight and say we would like to see the two. I see them complementary. The bicycling and pedestrian access, I see them as complementary to green spaces.
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Kimberly.
I was just going to ask for Elise and you too, Brian. I mean, when we talk about incentives generally, but is there something in particular where it's just like this would really make a difference? I mean, this would help us be able to do some of these things on our sites.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way the code's written now is like we have to provide a certain amount of green space and parkland or whatever it may be, depending on the project. I think, especially like for infill developments, it may make sense that let's get rid of that and enhance something that is kind of regional or something in that area just to make the overall place a better, more connectivity, green space, whatever it may be, because kind of handicapped on your own property to provide that sometimes. So I think if there was more of a master plan for open space, green space, parkland connections, bikeway connections, that would make sense where that way you have the forefront of, where you can actually enhance or develop or improve these areas. And that way, the land that, we're developing isn't so constricted. And then sometimes it can be pulled away where it just, we got a little pocket park, but nobody uses it. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, to underscore Brian's point, a lot of that also happens ironically on smaller parcels where, you just have this huge requirement, this row requirement, it takes up a large portion of the small property. So on the infill sites, it's especially difficult to maintain those, again, the FRO ordinances and whatnot.
Yeah, I think it would be crucial to have a master plan like Brian was saying. I mean, parks in each development kind of makes sense when you're talking about larger residential developments that are kind of spread out over, what we are used to in the past, spread out over farmlands. But when you're talking about dense development like the little pocket parks don't always make sense. But if we have a master plan of interconnecting bikeways and parkways or green spaces that kind of lay over the whole plan for the South Corridors, I think would make much more sense than individual property requirements at each spot.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And that actually came up in one of our sessions last week that I know some of you all were in, but I think it was Kelly Russell that pointed out that, she's sort of seen this enough times where you get all this little patches of green, they're not connected, there's not any kind of like order or coherence to it, and they're unused.
And that's why I like number one's plan so much. It was the way they drew in the interconnectivity. I had some other problems with it, but that part of it I really liked.
And then we at least saw 3 of those options have some level of green space.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
Yep.
I think that's important. And right now, that whole South Corridors area, I mean, for me, it's just visually harsh. It's not pleasing to the sight or pleasing to humans. A lot of it's, like I commented at the first meeting, when you look at it from the drone, there's a lot of asphalt there. I mean, it's just a very harsh environment. And so I think it's particularly important as we do have more dense development that we soften it somehow and create green spaces.
And how you soften that, well, depending on how you want to approach it. Ballinger Creek Trail is very popular. People love it. And I already got people, for the past 12 years, I've been trying to get people to ride their bike to work because it's relatively accessible. But when that trail came in, I can tell you it was a real big boost in seeing people getting on the bike or walking it. And it's just a really nice little linear park. People enjoy it and they like it. And sometimes I have to kind of pull them into it because you're out in the concrete jungle and they don't even know it's there. But once I expose it to them, then it's like, wow, what a jewel. So we need more of those type of linear parks.
Yeah.
I think that's where the master plan comes in, because there's a lot of areas where it makes sense to connect the Ballinger Creek Park to the Monocacy River and just kind of expanding upon that. So I mean, there's a lot of places that make sense to do that, and I think being able to contribute to that, via a fee or whatever, in order to not do it on development makes a lot of sense.
And I should share with the group that I sit on the county BPAC committee, Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, and we had identified 3 really high priority areas to get bike path and pedestrian path. One is the East Street corridor that goes, would eventually go over 26 and connect with the H&F Trail in Walkersville. The other one is a side path to down New Design Road and connect to the C&O Canal. That is huge on our list. And that this would serve this particular community, this particular corridor well. If you have that side path that would connect, and then that allows people to ride out of the city or county and ride all the way down to C&O Canal and vice versa. We get people who spend lots of money, they like bike packing, and they want to go visit Frederick, but there really is not a safe, feasible way for them to ride to Frederick unless they're very experienced road cyclists.
So I don't think that there isn't a current like green space master plan, is there? No, okay. And I guess what is the feasibility of developing something like that or integrating that into like the Livable Frederick effort as like, is that a thing that could happen?
Well, I think more what we have in mind for this planning area is making those decisions as part of this plan. And the county does, I mean, I mentioned in an earlier session, the county does have a land preservation and parks and recreation plan. That's something that we're required to develop to be eligible for state program open space funding. But I mean, that's updated every 5 to 6 years. So it doesn't have the same kind of planning horizon as a plan like this.
So this may be discussed later when we are wrapping things up, but what kind of document is going to be sent to the Planning Commission when they actually tackle this for real?
It will be the staff draft.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it goes to the Planning Commission, obviously they can you know, change it however they see fit, and then it will go on to the council.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at, I mean, is it going to be like a visual graphic like this, or will it be zones indicated?
What we've been doing, and the other plan we're working on now is Sugarloaf, and what we're trying to do is, in addition to just sort of having the plan document that will recommend land use changes, we'll have a number of policies and recommendations. We're also trying to draft all the regulatory items at the same time, and so we don't want those to come 6 months later or a year later. I mean, when we talk about sort of, we want to have this new zoning district, like let's say that's what it is. We want that to be, how we've handled in Sugarloaf is we've included those things as an appendix, and we've talked about doing the same thing here. So you'd have the plan document, and then you could go to the appendix and see the draft text for the new zoning district or the new overlay or whatever it is. So we've already sort of thought through that and worked it out. And it's being considered at the same time that the plan is being considered.
I don't know if it was talked about at other meetings, but is this going to incorporate transit plan for last mile distribution?
And
So,
by
what-
last,
so what I mean by last mile distribution, I mean, Frederick is not super dense, but as you start to think about densification, last mile is you take large trucks and they come to a center, unload, and then it transitioned to smaller trucks like EV trucks, you know, smaller van trucks, so that you're removing that heavy, big trucks coming in through these communities to deliver food or what have you.
Yeah, so whenever you order something on Amazon, it says the vans or those small box trucks that show up to
Yeah,
you.
but you can also do that for like grocery stores.
Oh,
and
yeah.
these the smaller stores, retail that have big deliveries. There are these plans called last mile delivery where you have these distribution centers right outside of the city's limits, and you restrict the size of the trucks that can go through specific communities. One, it's carbon reduction emissions. 2, it's controlling traffic flow. 3, it also removes eyesore for those that live and work in the community.
I think that has come up some in these sessions, and I've also been part of larger conversations just about the entire county. And some of that, again, is focused on zoning. I mean, we have these definitions of warehouses and distribution centers that assume that these are going to be enormous facilities. And what we're seeing now is exactly what you're describing, that you have these much smaller warehouses, much smaller distribution facilities. So they don't necessarily need to be an industrial zoning district. So yeah, I mean, that conversation is happening. How do we accommodate that use and not push them into the industrial zone?
Let's see, we have about 8 minutes left. So I guess we haven't really talked too much about specific players, you know, who's going to really need to be on board to kind of make these things happen. So as we're thinking about these challenges or opportunities, I mean, I guess let's start with a big issue is sort of the school capacity and the APFO. I mean, if you're seriously trying to work within that framework or make changes to that framework, you know, what does that process look like?
Opening up a can of worms.
Yeah.
Well, the can of worm has been opened, so how are you gonna deal with it?
It's my job. I am a professional can of worms opener. I mean, realistically, is that like a thing that can be dealt with, or, you know, are you just trapped forever and sort of trying to like work around it?
Well, I know that there's been a number of developers talking about that very issue, the APFO, and wanting to revise it and make it less constraining. I don't know how far those discussions are getting.
Okay.
That may be above our pay grade here.
Sure.
But you know, I'm not sure that we have to get too much into the weeds of that with our visioning here, other than to recognize that will have to be dealt with. You know, and I think there's enough people in this group that are aware that schools will have to be, there will have to be access to schools somewhere near this area, and they can't grow too much until it's assured that the school capacity is there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an issue that's been going on for the last 8 years, I guess. It's something
longer.
Longer, yeah, but I think it's really kind of coming to a head over these last 4 years, or last couple of years. You know, really just getting more and more restrictive. And I think, you know, to Mark's point and everything, I think everybody knows that we're kind of at a point where residential development is going to kind of hit ahead, and you know, there's existing approvals, but beyond that,
right,
it's really, you know, if we want to kind of keep up with the times, and if we really want to grow this area, how, you know, we kind of have it here on the map, it's going to be really hard. So I think
it's going to be an important call out, and it's going to be something that we're going to have people at the council level to go ahead and say, we want to go forward with this, and we know that we need to make some changes, and we have to go ahead and just point it out for them, because without the change, it's going to be very difficult to develop this area.
Yeah, I mean, from what I'm hearing, it almost sounds like it would be impossible to build more housing if you don't have the school.
Well, yeah, you'll have to have the school
Right,
somehow.
yeah.
Somehow that has to come about.
Yeah. But
you
it
know,
sounds like that's sort of like also a kind of convoluted process, because you then have to get the school into the state plan to get the funding, and how long does that take?
You know, that might be where it's an opportunity to define maybe somebody who can be a champion for that at the council level and draft bills or policies that could help facilitate this process. But if you don't get the council on board, then it's going to be very difficult to move this forward.
So I see if we develop, you know, a vision for this area, and you know, with all the components to it, and the whatever the zoning happens to be, that I think at the forefront there has to be an understanding that to make this all happen, somehow schools will have to be figured into this whole equation. So as we're selling the vision and advocating for it, people will become aware that schools are an issue, obviously. And, if there needs to be some tweaking in the APFO to make it work better in this area and others even, there may have to be a task force just put together to look hard at that. And
Yeah.
without talking too much about it, in my role in the Affordable Housing Council, I had approached County Executive Gardner, it's been a year or so ago now, to look at fees, not just impact fees, but fees in general for developers that were, impeding some development. We weren't specifically talking about the APFO, but at that point in time, Jan didn't have much will to do that.
Sure, yeah.
But that's not to say it can't be done. So myself and another group have been looking at one ordinance, and we put together a task force on the moderately priced dwelling unit ordinance, and we've been grappling with that for a year now, and hope to have final resolution in the next couple of months. That's just one ordinance, and it's taken us over a year to try to get somewhere with that. And we will get something together, and then we'll start advocating for it to get it to the Planning Commission and the County Council, and et cetera. Something like that may have to be done for the APFO.
Yeah, I think we can just, as a committee, we can just make the recommendation that for this vision to be fully realized, you'll need to go ahead or recommend that you put together a fees committee that can help and ensure that this vision happens.
Well, and I think this is something that that obviously is going to require some additional thought, but I think, because we are doing this plan for this area, I think if we get buy-in from the council that yes, we want to see residential development in this area, we want to see mixed use, then maybe there is a solution that could be specific to this area, that we wouldn't necessarily have to sort of try to implement countywide.
Yeah,
great.
Not initially, yeah.
Yep.
We were talking about something of a master plan for greenways and bikeways. We may need another kind of master plan for how the schools are going to evolve and deal with that just for this area.
I think, when you have public-private partnerships, things can get done really efficiently. And maybe we look at the schools in this area as one of those. I'm familiar with a company in DC that basically builds stadiums or parking garages or schools off of lending on the bond rating of the city, which is not something that we're unfamiliar with. So, again, I'm not trying to say the obvious here, but, you could do something along those lines.
I think we certainly are getting to the point where city and Frederick County is no longer a small municipality, that we're getting to be a mid-size regional workhorse. And so those particular option, I think we should, be creative and take a look at it. It's now the right time to start using those type of tools to help develop the area.
Yeah, I would think so. Just, sort of my 2 cents, is if you're artificially restraining the development of housing like this, your housing prices are going to be impacted heavily, I would imagine. And I don't know that that's a great thing. I think, Mark, for you on the Affordable Housing Coalition, that's probably a big problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is.
All of our employees go to West Virginia now, or Hagerstown, because everybody I know from Montgomery County is priced out. So they're moving to Frederick.
Yeah.
Everybody in Frederick's going to Hagerstown.
Right.
It's really a problem.
Okay.
So yeah, I have, I'm an environmentalist, and I have many environmentalist friends. So they kind of go nuts when I talk about having more housing and just push back against it. So
it's a thorny argument for sure.
Yeah, you got to put them somewhere. So.
Yeah, exactly. You have to go somewhere.
Great. So we have about 10 seconds. Okay. We're all going to be kicked out, and I don't want to be interrupted again for this.
I'll see you in a little bit.
Yes.
To Hunter and my group, is it okay if I speak out if I'm the spokesperson, or does somebody else want to do that when it comes time to share?
You're getting a thumbs up from Dawn.
Okay.
So.
Go for it, Dennis. You know how to perform.
Sorry, you got cut off there, Karen. I also just got an email from Kevin Selner asking the host to let him back in the meeting. I don't know if
John, I'm in.
Yeah, I just let him back in.
Okay.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, well, I think we're all here now. Hopefully everybody had a interesting and productive discussion. So we're gonna do what we've been doing the last few sessions, and we'll do a little bit of a report out. So if there's a group member or a facilitator who wants to summarize the discussion, let's go ahead and do that. So maybe, let's see, who haven't we started with? Hunter, you wanna start your group? Hunter and Dennis?
Away, Dennis.
Sorry about that. Lost my mouse again. That's twice today. I have dying batteries. Our group, I think probably, I'm going to guess that there's a great amount of similarity between kind of the thoughts coming out of all of our groups this morning. So I'm going to focus on some of the big ideas that we talked about. I think the first was in terms of encouraging development and activity that would kind of grow and build this area in a coherent manner over time, given the fact that there are so many landowners and so many entities at play, that there really needed to be kind of a proactive approach from the public sector in making sure that the private sector would enjoy some predictability and certainty in terms of moving forward. Like, the worst possible thing we could do would be to not put forward a clear idea of what was expected or what was anticipated, because we are already dealing with a fractured landscape in terms of parcelization, for instance. So we talked a little bit about the idea of, rather than having each individual property owner responsible for their little chunk or segment of a particular infrastructural network or system, have the idea of a club or a pool or a larger effort that the private sector could feel comfortable in contributing to, even if it meant that something was not going to be constructed in year one. It might be something that happens in year 7, but if they can make that contribution, it allows them to move forward their project with the certainty that the system is following. I thought that was a very good point. We talked about regulatory frameworks quite a bit, and the need for, when you talk specifically about form-based codes, being more use agnostic, making sure that we weren't dictating a mix of uses on every single site, but rather allowing that to be a little more organic. And I think we've heard that from over the last few days. The idea of putting together a neighborhood or a series of neighborhoods that are very much tied together and interconnected through the pedestrian network, through bicycle network, through a local transit network. We even talked about drones as a potential delivery device for freight and potentially for human beings in the future, which was interesting. I think streamlining our codes, and more to the point, making sure that on the APFO, on the public facilities side, that there was a understanding of what could be developed. I think there's probably nothing more frustrating for the private sector to have zoning in place, to have a regulatory set of rules in place that allow you to do something and not be able to do it because of infrastructure that is very much out of your control. And I think it is our group felt it is incumbent on us as a community to kind of figure this out. If we want development to happen in this redevelopment area, then we've got to make sure that it actually can happen. And that's going to mean having very, very difficult conversations about schools and funding for infrastructure like that. We talked about the idea of kind of environmental issues in the district, mostly tied to energy, EV charging stations, for instance, that came up with our group as a potential area for investment, either through the public sector or through individual private sector participants, perhaps even making that a mandate going forward in site plan review. I think there were a couple of, I think this summarized it. And we had a couple people kind of imply this or actually say it out loud. The development community wants to see less of a box checking exercise in moving forward with development and more of a feeling as if there's a contribution to a larger whole. I mean, it's obvious in the private sector that an improvement by one benefits many around it. And if we can take that to heart in everything we do in the corridors areas and understand that all of these individual investments add up to something greater, I think it might help our perspective in convincing our elected officials how they need to move forward to make this all happen. And I think a couple of like odd things maybe that we talked about, the idea of commercial associations, kind of similar to HOAs, except on the commercial side, that we very well may have a lot of prohibitions in place right now in these associations associated with the small strip developments and some of the other sites as well, that we will have to kind of turn back or undo. Only we can't do it by government fiat. Those individual folks involved on those associations have to do it on our own, and there may be a need to communicate that to these folks who may not be aware of what's going on. So I thought that was a very interesting approach to moving forward with all of this, in particularly because it was something that we hadn't thought about. I'll end with the fact that, and I'm leaving some things out here, I'm sorry, but the last thing I want to share is there is probably a need to have some kind of a steering committee or a Congress for redevelopment in the South Frederick corridors, or however we want to approach it. We need to have a group that can serve both as a place for ambassadors for this planning effort, as well as an outreach arm, so that you can reach out to individual owners as well as to elected officials, and maybe even to some extent to serve as a think tank for ways forward that is not government and is not just private sector, but maybe a blending of the both. And I think that's probably a good model moving forward for a lot of what we do in the planning world. Am I missing any of the big ideas, folks, in my group? Okay.
Excellent. Thank you all. Let's move to John and Amanda, your group.
All right, John, hopefully you can see this. I can't make it any bigger.
So Amanda, do you want to report out? Do you want me to do it, or do you want to get someone from the
If you
group?
want to lead it, and then I can fill in with anything you might not say or what we talked about, or if anybody else in our group wants to jump in, feel free.
All right, I'll try to attempt a summary. So one of the first issues that came up was this idea of, when thinking about rezoning, to consider an overlay approach for mixed use, which is sort of like an optional zone that property owners can choose to employ if it meets their kind of operational and future development interests. And this would sort of allow businesses to continue to operate until, this idea that land redevelops when a certain trigger is reached, where the land value is more than kind of the use value. And so we also talked about how that the dynamics of that are not purely demand based, they're also kind of supply based. For example, if a park or new infrastructure comes, that can kind of affect the land value and then trigger, redevelopment. So, the idea is that land value is tied to regulation. So there's and infrastructure. So there's sort of this back and forth situation where the market demand can play a role, as well as supply of, in form of regulation and infrastructure can play a role. And that can lead to how redevelopment is triggered from a market perspective. There was some discussion of how to kind of not deal with, but take care of existing uses. So there was this notion of an economic development assistance program for relocation of uses, or at least, how do we facilitate it should the need arise? How do we facilitate the continuation of uses in another portion of the county? The notion that development can move forward more quickly if there are low barriers to being able to redevelop was discussed. And that deals with everything from zoning to the development review process in terms of the time frame required, having a clear idea of how long it would take to get a permit, as well as things like the infrastructure and mitigation costs. This notion of a road club was raised, which was something I hadn't heard about before, but I guess some of our members had actually participated in them. And it's this idea that when developers can kind of come together to provide infrastructure and cooperate to think about how infrastructure would be funded. And there was discussion about how that can be a good thing and a bad thing, because it's very difficult to get the development timeframes for various different organizations to be synchronized, and determining who pays for what was very difficult. We talked about the idea of a community development corporation in terms of serving as a bridge between the public and private sector, but also kind of as an entity that can secure funding for redevelopment projects and can serve as kind of this funding incentive for redevelopment to occur. We talked about the idea of a design review committee as an independent group that would sort of provide guardrails for what gets developed in the area. And there were pros and cons to that. If it's an additional barrier to redevelopment, that's clearly a con. If it's something that helps facilitate development, then that would be a good thing. We also talked about this idea that's been done in some jurisdictions of having sort of a set of pre-approved plans, such that if you built what this plan dictated, you could walk in and walk out with your permit and you'd have zero public process involved. And there was a significant amount of concern with that, especially in situations where we're looking at industrial uses, where there are much more technical criteria to the site planning, and that being something that would cause interests to move to other places. But there is also some possibility that that could be an incentive in certain situations, like in a purely residential environment or in a mixed use environment, where the building type would not necessarily have a lot of variation. And that was another concern in that the similarities, that there was fear that, or concern that these building plans would create more uniformity in the community, and that idea would have to be mitigated if that moved forward. Another kind of environmental concern is this notion that if buildings in the long term will have increased height, and people choose to provide solar panels on their roofs, how do you ensure that the rights to that resource, access to that resource, are ensured in the future, so that like a building doesn't block out someone's solar access? And that's a legitimate concern that we talked about. And finally, we talked about the accuracy of our population projections relative to environmental and climate change concerns and sea level rise. That sea level very realistically can cause a significant migration of population, and that would very likely, or Frederick would be a desirable place for people that are migrating from coastal areas. And how do we deal with that increased population beyond what sort of our projections talk about, which are more regressive? And the idea that we should focus on concentrating growth to preserve our rural, natural, and agriculture resources was discussed. And then finally, the last thing we talked about was one of the schemes. There were some critiques of putting residential in the southern portion of the scheme as being kind of less appropriate than in a northern portion. There was concern about mixing residential with warehouse uses, the idea that those are less compatible than mixing residential with commercial and other kinds of employment. And also this idea that if you located residential in that southern portion, it wouldn't be as concentrated as if you put it in the northern portion near the transit, and it kind of supports this more suburban approach to development. And I think that pretty much sums it up. Everyone else, please jump in if I missed anything.
Caroline, did we lose you? I can jump
Sorry.
in on.
Just talking to myself on mute. Kate, would you like to go group one?
Sure. Let me share my screen real quick here. Hold on. I don't see that option. I know it's here. Where is it? Bear with me. There we go. All right. I didn't have anyone shy in my group, so I'm hoping they will chime in. Okay. So I think, big picture, we started with, the acknowledgement that we still need some buy-in, specifically around kind of coming to consensus on the map, and that there has been a lot of discussion about the livable Frederick goals, but really making sure that those are well articulated on that vision map. So we have some clarity about the physical and kind of structural goals for the area in terms of how does it change from what it is today to something very different. But once you have that buy-in around the vision map, the county has a pretty well set of steps in terms of that policy change. So we get the vision, we get that buy-in, and then it moves through steering committee to planning commission to county. So that then sets up the zoning updates, rezoning, and that sort of thing. So the process is well defined. What we also talked about, though, just a couple of things, and one is the fact that, and we saw this in the polling earlier, that there's general consensus that there's plenty of market demand. It literally is the fact that it's not enabled. And when I say enabled, it's not, the zoning's not there. So the minute that gets changed, you could expect a lot of activity. There was some comments brought up by John in particular about there's a lot of discussion in the office real estate community right now about what's going to happen. And there seems to be growing consensus that people are coming back, but they're going to have different expectations of office space to be more collaborative. So one of the ideas, I think, as it relates to this area is thinking about new collaborative spaces nestled within kind of neighborhoods. And when we think about mixed use, really thinking about these collaborative office models, if you will, in those centers. We talked then about, if we know the process is well defined in terms of next steps, what are some of the specific regulations that may need to be explored? And we talked about the difference between form-based code and Euclidean zoning. And I think there was support for wanting to do something different and moving towards form-based code. Not to say that that's the end all be all answer, but to get the kind of placemaking that is desired for this area, which is much more holistic, really moving in a form-based code direction, folks were pretty happy, or basically saying that was the way to go. And to that point, the other big thing is universally, it seems like everyone's very supportive of this larger green infrastructure strategy. Well, how do we get that done? Well, one of the ideas is that instead of kind of requiring a site-by-site approach to stormwater management or open space, that you actually take a district-wide approach and you create something like an eco district where every development and every parcel contributes to this overall pooled fund, if you will, to build something like that. So that's kind of an eco district approach. Seemed to be interesting going in that direction. There was a comparison also that if you took that sort of approach, you could kind of, model it similar to the city of Frederick. They're kind of park infrastructure group. They've got a Parks and Rec Commission. So something like that may be needed in this area. The other thing we talked about placemaking, on the southern end, you've got Monocacy Battlefield. You've also got kind of the Buckystown, hamlet. So there's sensitivity down there. And it sounds like there's some I guess, positives relative to existing designations of the battlefield and viewshed protection that can be kind of leveraged to make sure that there is a way to continue to buffer and create a transition from this kind of urban more intense to the more rural places. The one thing though that I thought was also important to note is that Monocacy as a National Park Service property is desiring to be a destination location. So what that means is there's going to be support then for kind of Monocacy as a destination for tourists, downtown Frederick as a destination. So how do you use those two kind of anchor tourism sites? How should that influence what happens in between? So I thought that was an interesting idea to be further explored. And then we transitioned to kind of the who. And a couple of things just to note here is that because this location is a place where a lot of people work and shop, your constituents are from all over the county and may actually be from other parts of the region. So that's something that's going to be interesting to build consensus with that group. We talked about school board being there. As this area redevelops over time, you got to kind of build all of that social network. So your faith-based institution, your community groups, those sorts of things. And lastly, so much of the property out here is commercially owned. So getting a property owners group put together. So similar to like the Golden Mile Alliance or something like that, because ultimately those big property owners, commercial interests will need to come together around some of these issues to support kind of the proposed change. Did I miss anything from my group? Oh, and maybe a few more elected officials in the room to build consensus.
Excellent. Thanks, Kate. So I will give a brief recap of our group, group 2. So I think actually I've heard a lot of the things we discussed hit on already. We discussed sort of 4 like overarching things. So the first was the adequate public facilities ordinance in the schools, and the need to address this restraint or constraint on housing development. The discussion was really focused on, making sure that we're generating buy-in for this vision for the planning area first, and then understanding that, in order to move forward to fully realize this vision, that there's going to maybe be needed a more flexible approach or more innovative partnerships. So like public-private partnerships that might be able to facilitate the development of more schools. So we're sort of not in this bottleneck of schools versus development. We discussed the zoning in the planning area and the fact that what exists now as far as zoning regulations really supports uses that are sort of, we've moved beyond, there needs to be more flexibility, need to allow more mixed use in the planning area. We talked about mitigating some of the community resistance that came up as a challenge in the polls. And it seemed that one of the things that needs to happen is to make sure that folks feel like they're being provided choices. So, not going to the public with a final plan in place, but allowing a little bit of discussion like we've been doing here and some options. Also making sure that folks realize that, developing this area doesn't mean, pushing people out or pushing existing businesses out. So making sure that there's programs in place to support local businesses and workforce development and cultivating connections between businesses and decision makers and the residential community. And then lastly, we talked about the Green Network. One of the things that could be useful here is having sort of a master vision for that Green Network, and then also providing more flexible options for developers. Kate, I think this was sort of what your group was getting at with like the district-wide approach. So this is, especially for infill development, is a challenge because you often end up with these sort of like not so useful green spaces, and folks in our group thought it would be much more useful to contribute to sort of a regional or district-wide or existing facilities to provide that public good. And those are really sort of the key things we focused on. Different folks that we mentioned engaging are local business owners and the the council support for, changing regulations and policies, but really having this vision in place to go forward and use as a foundation, knowing that it was built on consensus from lots of different stakeholder groups is going to be a key to moving things forward in this planning area. So great discussions. I think those are all excellent points that can be brought forward into development of the plan. So I'm going to pull up my screen and I'm actually going to pass it over to John to do a little bit of wrap up and let folks know what's next. Can you see my screen?
So, hello, everybody. I want to just, sincerely say that we as planning staff, we really do appreciate everything, all of the time you've contributed, all the ideas you've contributed. You have our sincere gratitude for this. I personally feel like it was extremely productive. I learned a lot, heard a lot of really good ideas, and I feel like we have some really good direction to go forward here, with some next steps. So what we're going to do now after today is take a little bit of time to sort of process these results. I do want to say, though, that we will be posting the recordings of these sessions to our project website. So that should be happening shortly. But so as we process these results, we are going to have some follow-up meetings with our scoping group to kind of talk through some of this. So if you are out there and you're on the scoping group, please kind of pay attention for a meeting email in the next week. And then we're going to kind of integrate all of this into what we hope is a coherent, feasible, realistic, but visionary plan. And we're going to kind of officially release that as a draft to the Planning Commission for their kind of formal review and development process. And during all of this, we're going to try to maintain communication. We'll be posting updates on our Facebook page. There's our Livable Frederick Facebook page. So, you can subscribe to that to stay current. And we'll also be providing kind of schedule updates and other kinds of information on our project page. That's also where we'll put the videos of this session. And that's www.frederickcounty.md.gov/8141. Yes, it's a numeric web address. We are the government, so we wanted it more decimal points, but we're gonna have to deal with 8141. I also want to emphasize that this is the beginning of the process, not the end. This is just kind of one point in which there will be opportunities for input and feedback and sort of further reactions to what we're doing. So again, thank you to Renaissance Planning for doing such a stellar job putting this together. We really appreciate it. It's, it really far exceeded my expectations. And, just personally, my sincere gratitude to everyone for helping us out.
All right, thanks, John. So I think that's it. We will adjourn, and thank you all again for a super productive and successful set of sessions. We're excited to watch this plan move forward. As always, if there's anything you forgot or you want to share, please don't hesitate to email me or any other member of the team. Yeah, thanks so much. This is great. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.